Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Baker Institute. I'm Edward Juregid. I'm the founding director of the Institute. When I joined the Baker Institute in 1994, I knew that energy issues would be obviously an important part of our Institute's work. We were located in Houston, the energy capital of the world. Former Secretary of State Baker and I, with our long experience in the Middle East, understood firsthand the importance of the vital links in the energy market supply chain. Like many who were in public service in the 1970s, we understood the direct impact secure energy supplies have on daily life and prosperity in America and in the world. With the decline in domestic oil production and continued strong increases in oil demand, the United States is more dependent on foreign oil than ever before. In 2005, America imported around 11 million barrels a day, or about 60% of the roughly 20 million barrels consumed each day. This is up by 35% in 1973. The share of imported oil is projected to grow to close to 70% by 2020, with the United States becoming increasingly dependent on Persian Gulf supply. The geopolitics of this are very significant given the turmoil in that region. In light of this growing dependence on imported oil and in the wake of the aftermath of Hurricanes Rita and Katrina, the United States has witnessed some of its highest oil prices to date. Crude oil prices have been extremely sensitive to both internal and external conflicts involving the world's oil-producing countries. Environmental trends have further impacted the energy picture. More than 2/3 of total petroleum use in our country is transportation-related. The transportation sector, personal automobiles, buses, trucks, planes, will constitute over 70% of the future increase in oil demand. As a result, American policymakers have become acutely aware of the need to offer long-term strategies, particularly those in the transportation sector, that would prevent gasoline shortages in the future and lessen America's vulnerability to oil supply shocks from abroad. With the rise of gasoline prices, the problem of decades of underinvestment and an ongoing shortage of refining capacity in the United States has become more widely understood. Public discussion of the state of the U.S. refining industry focused on two elements: the difficulties of expanding domestic capacity to meet rising U.S. gasoline demand, and the possible dangers of having so much of that United States refining capacity concentrated in one geographical area, the U.S. Gulf Coast, that is vulnerable to weather-related disruptions. As debate gathers momentum on how to solve our gasoline woes, biofuels have come front and center as a potentially environmentally friendly means to supplement the United States transportation fuel supply system. Today, the United States produces 255,000 barrels a day of primarily corn-based ethanol. Though U.S. ethanol production is almost equal to Brazil's, ethanol still only represents a meager 3% of the 9.1 million barrels of gasoline Americans consume every day. To have biofuels play a more important role in the U.S. energy equation, new policies and new technologies will obviously be needed. The major obstacle to expanding the role of biofuels is the lack of infrastructure. American car makers have expressed a willingness to increase production of flex fuel cars that can run on ethanol fuel. However, current U.S. ethanol production is concentrated in the Midwest region of our country, and difficulties remain with the ethanol distribution system in other parts of the country. Indeed, of the 563E85 ethanol fuel pumps in the United States, over 45% are located in two states, Minnesota and Illinois. Congress has supported our domestic ethanol industry with a generous 51 cent per gallon federal tax credit for ethanol refiners and blenders, as well as a 54% gallon tariff placed on imported ethanol. However, questions remain about the viability of relying on corn-based ethanol as the solution to our fuel diversity. Other, perhaps more efficient and effective options need to be investigated. And it is this search for a more thoughtful understanding of the potential of biofuels that has led us to convene today's conference. There are many biofuels alternatives currently under study in the United States. Cellulose ethanol is one feedstock thought to have the most long-term viability, yet this alternative is far from cost-effective using present technology. Investment is also increasing in facilities to produce biodiesel fuel from waste oil and oil-rich plants, as well as ethanol produced from agricultural waste. We will hear today from practitioners and scientists about the state of play in the biofuels industry. Our keynoters include industry leaders whose companies are making a commitment to large-scale biofuels plants, as well as scientists searching for breakthroughs that can raise the efficiency and cost-effectiveness of biofuels manufacturing. I am pleased to say that Rice University is committed to this effort to find breakthroughs in biofuels capability. Not only are our engineering and biology groups deeply involved in critical research in this area, but our students, the Rice students, are practicing what we preach. For those of you who may have taken the Rice shuttle bus to our building today, you will have an opportunity to give a round of applause to the students who manufactured the fuel for those buses from the waste oil from our cafeterias and campus kitchens. That's innovation. Our students are studying the environmental impact of biodiesel with the support of the Baker Institute, Rice's George R. Brown School of Engineering, and the Shell Center for Sustainability. Today's Biomass to Chemicals and Fuels Science, Technology, and Public Policy Conference is aimed to investigate the potential for biofuels to contribute to U.S. energy security and to highlight the research and development of new technologies and scientific breakthroughs needed to make biofuels a viable alternative to oil-based fuels. This conference, like our Nanoscience and Energy series, is also part of a broader campaign to reinvigorate public interest in the physical sciences. A bipartisan effort to address our energy security dilemma through revolutionary technologies could generate an excitement and idealism similar to the one that swept the nation, and particularly our young people, the height of the space program in the 1960s and 1970s. This indeed is something that we have been working on with our science and engineering faculties here. At present, oil and natural gas-based businesses represent the core of Houston's energy sector. Oil and gas represent over half of the type of energy used to meet the world's primary energy requirements. But the growing supply challenge means that we will need improved technologies to find and use fossil fuels more efficiently. Over the longer term, investment is likely to rise in alternative fuels and technologies. Houston will need to position itself to acknowledge the important role that non-fossil energy and new energy technologies are going to play in the world's energy supply and participate in this new energy future. Working together with Rice University and other Texas universities, our energy industry will be preparing our country for the transition to a broader spectrum of energy sources by promoting the fundamental analysis and science needed to bring us to a sustainable energy future that is less dependent on foreign supplies. To quote my friend and colleague, the late Richard Smalley, the Nobel laureate and a founding father of nanoscience, quote, "What is needed is a vast effort capable of providing twice the amount of energy we consume today. We will need to develop a clean, affordable answer that can serve as the basis for sustained economic prosperity for 10 billion people. Current technology will not be able to accomplish this. We need stunning new discoveries in underlying core science and engineering to enable an answer," end quote. This conference could not be more timely. I have just returned from the Clinton Global Initiative meetings in New York City, where I was a personal guest of former President Clinton as a member of the CGI's advisory board on mitigating ethnic conflict and religious conflict. How to meet increasing energy needs and the challenges of global climate change were key subjects that were addressed. People are beginning not only to talk the talk, but to walk the walk. As at the conference, Sir Richard Branson committed his Virgin business empire, as I'm sure you've read, to spending $3 billion over the next years to help combat global warming. Renewable energy would be the focus of the investment, particularly the research and development of biofuels. That's why I say our conference could not be more timely. Today's conference, organized by the Baker Institute and the Rice Departments of Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering, Civil and Environmental Engineering, and the Energy and Environmental Systems Institute, has brought together policymakers, scientists, opinion shapers, and business leaders to showcase potentially revolutionary breakthroughs in the biomass area. I would like to thank Engineering Dean Sally Keller-McNulty and our Rice Engineering faculty, Kyriakos Zigourakis, George Bennett, Raymond Gonzalez, and Pedro Alvarez for their work in organizing the wonderful panel of presenters for the coming 2 days. Also, I commend my energy team at the Baker Institute, Amy Jaffe, Ken Medlock, and Matthew Chen, for their creativity and passion in marrying Rice science together with our public policy programs. And we are especially thankful to Shell and our Energy Forum members for their generous support of our energy, science, and technology policy program. It is our hope that Rice University can play a leadership role building the bridge to our sustainable energy future. And there is no better example of that than our keynote speaker, Andy Karsner, the current Assistant of Renewable Energy at the U.S. Department of Energy. I am proud to say that Andy, who has worked tirelessly to bring new energy technologies into the electric power and transportation sector, is an honors graduate of Rice University. You have his very illustrious bio in your program notes. He is perhaps the most competent person we could ever bring to this forum. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming our keynote speaker to the podium.
Thanks very much. That set the bar real low. The most competent, I'll do my best. It's with mixed emotion that I get the chance to speak to you all today. I am positively giddy to be back on this campus and really behind a podium for the first time since my graduation day. So very exciting. All week, actually, I've been thinking about this, and to take you through a little bit of what goes on in the life of an assistant secretary and how that plays into the promotion of Rice University. I was having dinner seated between Harrison Ford and Robert Duvall the other night at the Conservation International Awards, and they were saying, "Well, what's the biggest thing going on in your week?" And I said, "Well, it's going home to Rice University." "Well, tell me about Rice University." And I kept thinking, David Lebron should write me a check for this. So we got those gentlemen excited, and it flowed into the next day because my colleague, who is also an assistant secretary and a Rice University alum, Karen Harbert, the assistant secretary for Policy and International, joined me and Secretary Sam Bodman to welcome President Musharraf at Blair House the following morning. And again, the conversation turned to Rice University. And this time, Karen had instigated it based on the fact that somebody's sibling was going to University of Texas in a baseball rivalry and this kind of thing. But interestingly enough, the secretary then piped in with all kinds of historical analysis of Rice University's early architecture and why the Venetian spires existed. And it was because that the Boston architects didn't want to come down to the place because they thought it was a swamp, but they checked the latitude and they found out it was almost where Venice was, so they would design a university. And the secretary wanted to trump both Karen and my story. So there are advantages of being Rice alums and being surrounded with so many sub-cabinet members that are from the university up in Washington. But amongst the biggest advantage is understanding that the problem that we face is not actually likely to be solved exclusively in Washington, D.C., but that Houston has a major role to play. And thank you, Ambassador, for the work you do here, and Amy and Dean McNulty. It was a pleasure to have a conversation with you and hear about your vision about how we could continue to ramp up Rice's role as an academic and a business and a scientific and research and development thought center as we move towards new energy and a new energy economy. I want to describe to you a little bit about the president's vision for the new energy economy today, and in particular the role that biofuels are going to play. The president made it very clear where his heart was on the matter, as he does with so many things in this year's State of the Union. He put words in the State of the Union that are seldom heard. In fact, some of them have never been heard in a State of the Union before. Words like wind, words like solar. And the president made very clear that his ambition for the remainder of his presidency, in fact, the legacy I think he would most like to be defined upon, is changing the way we power our homes and our offices and our vehicles. The president went so far as to say things that made headlines across the world when he said, and I take it as my charge, America is addicted to oil. It really is the defining statement for the job that I have to do. In many ways, it makes my job very prescriptive day to day, because there are few agencies within the federal government that get this kind of attention from the White House on almost a daily basis. The reasons are clear, and they've been clear for a long time, but they haven't crystallized in the way that they have most recently. And whatever is your driver for making them crystallize, whether it's the escalating price signals that are now de-escalating, in fact, or the geopolitical situation, or the environmental situation, it is a matter that all roads lead to this core challenge for the nation. We have got to get beyond the status quo and the incumbent energy technologies that are defining our economic destiny at this point, and move beyond them so that we do not let others leverage petroleum and conventional fuel sources over our economic future. On the environmental front, the challenges are clear, and I wish that you all had had the opportunity to hear from the head of the Council of Environmental Quality, who's most eloquent on this subject. It's an obvious fact. The world is warming. The pace is something that we have to confront. Sir Richard Branson is obviously doing his part, as are others. We take the view that nothing can do more than accelerating the deployment of new energy technologies and making sure that they penetrate markets at the most rapid rate that has ever been seen. And in fact, that is what is occurring. So even though we talk about it only being 3% today, we have to recognize that 3% today is a 350% growth rate over what it was a half decade ago. And so we are in a new domain of unprecedented growth rates for the totality of our technology portfolio, both on the generation side and on the transportation side, and as or more importantly, on the efficiency side for both. The economic challenges are clear. We have new competitors in the global arena. China and India have begun to manifest their economic development in a sustained way that presents us with a 21st century challenge that we will have to face. There are more people drawing on fewer resources. And again, this very obvious fact makes us address the scientific and technological problems that are limiting where America can be if we want to pass on fundamentally the American dream that you and I have shared to bring us to this point. And again, as importantly, the national security challenges. It's more than the countries that are hostile to our interest that we have to face. It is more than a discussion of Iran or Venezuela or the potential instability in Nigeria. Whether you're talking about Russia or North Korea, every part, or the economic destinies of China and India, every part of the world now is linked in such a way that energy is the common denominator of our economic futures and the pressures that tie us together. I'm not an environmental expert, and I'm not an energy economist, and I'm not an esteemed diplomat like the one you've just heard from. But what I do know is that our office, the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, responsible for the nation's applied science portfolio and the policy direction of these new energy technologies, is consulted daily, is drawn upon daily for solutions in these other realms. And so it is this critical convergence that you all are talking about today, and I hope that it is the beginning or the catalytic to a continued series of conversations on campuses like these that move towards problem solving. I think one of the biggest problems I always face is that when we get into a Q&A session with lesser informed crowds, I should say, we focus a lot on problem ID. And that's why I like to get it out of the way early, because we are so far beyond problem ID at this point and in such a need of problem solving that it is really a time for the country to come together. And whether the analog is being inspired by the space program, whether the analog is being inspired from the reactions you had on September 12th, 5 years ago, whatever it is that draws you to this forum, whatever it is that draws you to the national conversation, the point is it is high time to get involved with solutions. And so I thank you for your efforts there. And I'm going to limit my comments today so that we can maximize the amount of time we have in Q&A. I really see this as a three-legged stool. And I've described sort of a three-pronged part of the problem. Let me describe the three-legged stool that I view really as the solution. And I want to emphasize each leg of it because sometimes, depending on where we come from, we tend to think that our leg is the most important leg, and the other ones, well, if they just existed, that would be fine. You know, from a the first leg, and each of these in my mind being indispensable, but the first leg is one that the government has actually been pretty good at. I have the great privilege of working with our fine, renowned national laboratories and the legendary names, and Dr. McNulty, you told me you'd worked at some of them, Los Alamos and Sandia and Lawrence Berkeley and Lawrence Livermore and Argonne and Oak Ridge, and I have the privilege of associating with these people on a daily basis. And so I have great confidence that the research and development leg is strong and growing stronger. Few administrations have invested more in climate change science and in renewable energy technologies than this administration. But those investments largely go towards long-term goals for hardware. Long-term goals that are very, very important for us to get to the solution. But how we get there is really dependent on the other legs of this three-legged stool. The second leg, which often is confused because we are in such new territory, is the policy leg. How do we plan the appropriate policies with sufficient predictability and longevity and durability to accommodate the change we seek as our scientific discoveries, as our innovation finds its way into markets? And markets really is the third leg of that three-legged stool. And if you're a project finance guy like me, you break that down further and you say it's equities and investment and finance, and it's really markets that need to be addressed. I come from a school of thought that really says we cannot get to sustainability without addressing profitability. Government cannot regulate its way exclusively into the realm of regulate the invention into the realm of the market without making sufficient profitability for whatever the paradigm is to sustain itself on a recurring basis. And there are those in Washington, unfortunately, I think, that have the theory that markets work perfectly. These people tend to not have any experience in markets. And to be from a market, you would know that markets, like anything else, have imperfections. And the capacity for good policy to address the imperfections so that the intrinsic characteristics of new energy technologies, like the biofuels you'll be discussing today, find their way into market. All of these three things, all of these three legs have to work together for this stool to stand up. Now, just as much as I'm inspired by the historic efforts, the Manhattan Project and the Apollo Project and some of the great national things we've had in the past, I tend to get recalcitrant when we talk about them because I view this challenge as so much greater. We're fundamentally talking about market transformation of the largest industries in the world. When we talk about the energy industry and the automobile industry, this is not a single end-use point of sale, captive customer like the federal government. And what I worry about from the time I arrived at DOE and the legacy of these great efforts of the past is that we tend to rely on them as our analog. We tend to think that if we just put enough dollars in any one laboratory at any given time, maybe if we just put a few guys in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains with white lab coats and a good chalkboard, that they'd emerge at a given moment and go, voila, I found the solution, eureka, it works. And we'd have the comparable to Fat Man and Little Boy, and the whole problem would just go away over a gradual period of time somehow because the great national experiment would have been realized. And I worry about us getting stuck in that vision and not understanding this vision for the scale that we must address in order to actually make an impact and get to the solution. Well, part of that is that over time, you've got to realize the Department of Energy was founded out of that Manhattan Project effort. And so over time, we are dealing with the lethargy and the legacy of an institutional bureaucracy that began in that realm where we see things as a singular pipeline of research and development. And if you shove enough dollars into the front of the pipeline, you just keep plumbing that pipe, the dollars make their way through invention and American innovation. At the end of it comes a baton, and that baton goes through the looking glass to the market, and people say, that's technology transfer. It just happened right there at that point. The technology transfer baton got passed, and we changed everything. And of course, unfortunately, we're finding that's not the way it happens. In fact, to the extent that baton gets passed at all, quite frequently when we are not paying attention to the other legs of the stool, that baton falls into somebody else's basket. It rarely finds its way into the American market in the way that it was designed. In fact, it finds its ways into lithium-ion battery factories in South Korea, into chip makers in Taiwan, into solar cell facilities in Nanjing and in Kunming. And we have to address this problem as a means of global competitiveness. We have to address it holistically. We have to recognize that we're in a different world, that there is not a singular pipeline of R&D. And in fact, the way it is today, to take from, who is it, Mao Zedong, may a thousand flowers bloom, that we have thousands of pipelines across the United States, many of them funded by the private sector, as should be encouraged, many of them originating on college campuses, many of them in consortia today with our national laboratories. And my goal at the end of the pipe, my colleague, Dr. Ray Orbach from the Office of Science, has the origination point in the pipe, the very important basic science program, funded about 4-to-1 over our budget, where the study of phenomena takes place, where they're working on quantum dots for solar cells, where hydrogen storage is the issue of examination, as opposed to my end at the front end of that pipe. And Ray and I like to think that pipe has a seamless weld between us where things interact. But at my end of the pipe that faces out to the market, my objective is to open that pipe, is to make it more of an inverted funnel, make that more of a window so that people can see what the real world is and react with it in far greater iterative loops. So we have an obligation in government today, given the size of the challenge, to update ourselves, to redefine the paradigm, to understand that we have to become relevant to the markets in a way that brings those iterative loops so that we have greater throughput, so that fundamentally the pipeline is shortened and the diameter is broadened and the pace of throughput is quickened. That is part of our goal in what we're doing there today. And we've got a good story to tell in what has actually been happening. One thing I love, I was abroad for 12 years, and it satisfied me to no end that one of the greatest things about America, when people would inevitably get in these discussions of what do you think about America, and my fellow American expats would be around, or somebody would fly out from the States, sometimes even from Rice University. Rich Smith would come through Hong Kong, and we'd say, well, what's going on back in America? And they'd say, well, I'm terribly dissatisfied. And this is something that always made me happy. Americans are permanently dissatisfied with the status quo. It means we are always itchy to get something greater. It almost doesn't matter how great we have it. We know there is something better to be achieved. And that is really the case when it comes to these fuels and fuel sources. We're in no position to rest on our laurels, even as we've moved out into completely uncharted territory, even as our growth rates have hit these astronomical upward growth curves. I was listening to some of the ambassador's statistics, which are outdated. Not because he hasn't read them right, not because they probably weren't posted on the internet, because the pace of growth is almost non-measurable. Today, we've actually passed Brazil's ethanol growth. That's only happened in this year. It wouldn't have been possible or even predictable 4 years ago. But the rate of capital formation for new biofuels development is in an unprecedented boom. And so we actually, even EIA, the Energy Information Agency, doesn't have accurate statistics. The agricultural economist doesn't have accurate statistics. The commoditized indexes in Chicago and New York don't have accurate statistics because the rate of growth is on too steep of a curve and the cost curve is declining at too steep of a rate, and capital formation is occurring at such a rate that new money is entering the market from new places in ways too quick to measure. You had said 565 E85 pumps available. I had a hearing that I was preparing for last week, and I said, how many E85 pumps? And someone said 763. Another guy said 822. Well, I said, well, which is it, 822 or 763? They said, well, why don't you call these three firms? You know, and I went to dinner with a fellow from Walmart. He said, you know, we're committed to launching these 400 from Sam's. And so we're really, Ford can tell you that they're working with Verasun, I believe, and GM has got efforts out with Verasun and Avanti, and the rate of growth in the marketplace is such that there will be a point where we take a breather, but we're much more interested in keeping the sprint running while we have the relatively good price signals than we are in measuring with absolute poignant accuracy. The most important thing of it is to understand what is the underlying catalysis for this new wave of growth. And is this going to be a traditional boom-bust ethanol period in time, and not just ethanol, but biofuels in general, or is it something that we can do in the policy realm, in the realm of markets, in the realm of new R&D towards cellulosic ethanol and biofuels that can begin to take off the peaks and shave off the valleys and get to some profitability and price equilibrium that allows for steady and predictable growth so that we can get towards some of the president's objectives. Again, the objectives are things that he made very clear for us in the State of the Union. And people said, well, what is the president's vision? And I have a difficult time when you talk about what the vision was from the State of the Union, because the president actually charged us with making cellulosic ethanol commercially viable in a conversion plant by 2012. Well, I'm a project developer by trade. And when you say 2012, it's really outside of the realm of a vision. You're now into the realm of a business plan. You're now into the realm of quantifiable days and months to come up with a facility that can produce commercially competitive ethanol. Well, our price point for commercially competitive ethanol was, at the time, $1.07. We said, well, this is what corn ethanol was doing in the marketplace that was able to sell, was $1.07. Of course, we know what happened since then with the price of oil on the fuel markets and the relative comparison. So one should say, well, if that goes up, then in theory, your competitive pricing goes up. So maybe it's before 2012. Wherever it falls, what we do know is that U.S. corn-based ethanol will eventually hit a plateau and cap out. And different people are on different spectrums of where they think that is. Obviously, the corn growers and Monsanto and I think DuPont is working on a genetic corn breed, have their own ideas about that being much, much higher, 25 to 30% higher than the government estimates, and other people think it's lower. Wherever it is, it's a point where we would like, for the sake of the country, to maximize the domestic biorefining capacity of conventional corn-based ethanol, and not just maximize it for the sake of taking a relatively easy technology and relatively easy economic investment and making it whole, but also so that it paves the way for an ethanol and biofuels transportation infrastructure in general. The ambassadors rightfully pointed out that this is an area that must require more and more of our attention. we have an obligation to understand how terminaling facilities and transportation infrastructure, and even how contractors and engineering procurement contracts will play into commercialization and replicability of a biofuels economy. In general, our goal is to achieve 30% displacement of on-road fuel sources by 2030. And we have convened numerous groups towards that end, both in the realm of electricity and plug-in hybrids, of biofuels and biodiesel that you heard discussed today. And we have specific prescriptions from the Energy Policy Act that will help get us there. We have the Section 932 solicitation that is currently on the street for $53 million that we expect to announce in the first quarter of next year for the first joint venture on a commercial scale facility. We are standing up the loan guarantee program that in its initial phase will allow for $2 billion of leveraged investment of the federal balance sheet. And of course, the renewable fuel standards are in place to prescribe how much renewable fuel should get into the marketplace. I went with the Secretary to Detroit in my first week in office, and he made a point of explaining to the automakers his view that E85 should not be just a Midwest fueling option, but should ultimately become a nationwide fueling option. We like to believe that the consumers in this country should drive fuel choice and vehicle choice. And so I think the Secretary's words were more vehicle types of all vehicle classes need to engage in adaptability given the opportunity for flexible fuel. And that will be necessary to achieve some degree of uniform predictability to ensure that people can assess what their markets are for traffic so that they can bring those pumps to bear on the market. DOE can't do this alone. Fundamentally, we can at best be a convener. There was a time 2 decades ago when the Department of Energy, when the federal government was 90% of the capital invested in renewable energy technologies. Today, that number is about 0.3%. There were $40 billion of clean energy transactions last year, and that does not count the market capitalization of the companies that are largely today listed on the AIM in London and NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange. So we have to figure out that our role to be relevant, to redefine that pipeline, is to be iterative and catalytic with the private sector and with academia, and working hand in hand to come up with new forms of public and private partnership to take on this massive challenge. Well, I said that it's been almost 2 decades since I spoke on this campus, and I was just, I'm not even sure I had peach fuzz back then, but it was my graduation day, I recall, and it was beneath the Sally Port, and I remember challenging my students, my fellow students, my colleagues back in those days, my peer group, and using Kennedy's words and saying that the time to repair the roof is when the sun is shining. And those were the days before the Berlin Wall had even fallen. And we were so full of hope and opportunity that we would make an impact on a new world order. And of course, a lot has happened since then. But even as I come back here today, Ambassador, and thank you for having me, those are still the things that come to my mind, is that we are full of opportunity. And when I walk around this campus and when I think of the folks that are gathered here and the conversations you'll have today, I still think the sun is shining. I still think we have an opportunity now to make a difference. And I know that the President has charged us as never before to put all things on the table, that this is the essential, what I have called the domestic epicenter of our war on terror. It is our opportunity to gain back leverage over our economic future, to gain back some modicum of influence over our environmental well-being, and to impact our national security. And so what we look for people to do is to join us, and we want to be good listeners, and I intend to listen here as much as I can, so that we can say that when we were faced with all these challenges at the beginning of the 21st century, when the sun still was shining, that we came together, that people of all parties and all professions, that people who had all different parts of the legs on the stool in their bailiwick came together and faced these problems, and together we made a vigorous start. Well, thanks very much. I'd like to take any questions you have. Do we have time for questions?
Yeah, we have time for a few questions. Good one. I guess not. So speak loudly so we'll catch you on the, because we're webcasting. Questions?
DeForest Ralph with the gas price report. You didn't mention anything about gas from liquids as part of the solution to the thing. Do you have any initiatives, or what's your position on gas to liquids technology as a solution for diesel fuel?
Well, GTL's, my position in general is we need all we can get. So whether you're talking about coal to liquids, gas to liquids, that's my personal position. I didn't mention it specifically because it's not in my portfolio. That fundamentally the department is divided in between two general realms when we talk about applied things, three general realms rather: nuclear energy, fossil energy, and the everything else shop, the future shop. I'm the future shop, and the gas to liquids, just like IGCC and carbon sequestration, are all very important efforts. But I personally don't deal with them significantly on a daily basis. But the general position of the administration is we will need all the energy, particularly domestic energy and clean energy, we can muster.
Sergio Trindade. Every drop of alcohol that leaves a U.S. distillery is actually E95 because it gets a little gasoline to be denatured. On one hand. On the other hand, every gas station in this country has 3 or 4 types of gasoline. Why do we have to have a separate infrastructure for E85? Can't we retire one of the 3 or 4 gasoline pumps in all of the gas stations and make that an E95 pump and get the auto industry to put a little gasoline tank for cold start when it's needed?
Well, it's a great question. I'm glad you guys have convened Ford Motor Company and some of these other BP is here to answer some of those questions, and I'm hoping you're going to stand up and ask those exact same things again while we're webcast. But I'll give you my view on it. I mean, there are more technical challenges than you might assert in that, just relative to the characteristic and the properties of the ethanol and its ability to use existing infrastructure. In your case, you're just talking about the storage at the end use retail, as opposed to the. I'm more focused right now on the transportation and delivery and distribution infrastructure, which is far greater impediment. And as you suggest, we think it should be easier. For example, if you took out a mid-grade fuel and substituted it for E85, and I think you were suggesting E95, but I believe there's a maximum on the 15% blend that's necessary relative to the existing flexible fuel sensors and technologies that go into the vehicles. But I'll defer to some of the auto companies that are here to discuss those technologies, relatively speaking. But when it comes to the question of E85, we are really very much stuck, as you imply, in a chicken and egg problem between the auto companies and the oil downstream distribution and retail companies. And we are keen to continue a very direct dialogue with all these parties to try and break out of this chicken and egg situation. We're doing that in today as a voluntary dialogue. There are many on the Hill who would like to go well beyond voluntary dialogue to break that circle open. I think that there has been a lot of good faith demonstrated by a lot of parties in terms of how much they're going to ramp up flexible fuel production. I think from the standpoint of the oil industry today, I don't want to speak for them, but of course they are more concerned with ramping up and substituting for MTBE with ethanol and using ethanol as up to a 10% splash blend. So you are seeing universally almost all of the gas stations in this region and increasingly across the country posting signs that say contain 10% ethanol. Well, we want to look at the problem holistically. There will be a point where we might pass E10, and at that point you would expect that ethanol would have a very different nature, economic value in the marketplace, and that the retail values would move on more rapidly. Today, it is very, very constrained as E85 or larger than E10 blends, generally because of the economics of the supply chain, even as we ramp up and increase in percentage of the overall petroleum displacement. Sir?
What is the administration's response to California's recent policy on greenhouse gas emissions? And do you think the administration would go so far as to encourage other states to follow California's example?
Well, it's one thing for California to put something on paper. It's another thing for California to implement it. I mean, we've just found that out with California's, alleged deregulation model that was meant to be the prize of the national portfolio in terms of deregulation and what that did to their electricity sector and rolling blackouts and brownouts and the pricing that they're still suffering of, along with the bankruptcies. So I appreciate that California has a very unique set of politics that on occasion yield some very good results, particularly in the realm of efficiency. On occasion yield some very bad results, as they have shown with electric deregulation. We'll have to see where the California's unique brand of politics takes it with regard to this recent policy. I don't think that to the extent that any sovereign jurisdiction or city wants to embrace principles that it deems being in its interest to clean up its environment, I don't think, and to the extent that they are not preemptive with federal law, I don't think the administration generally takes a benign position in the sense that we respect the jurisdictions of all comers. The city of Austin has the most aggressive green energy program in the nation. It doesn't have a Kyoto signatory sort of a statement at the front end of that. It's just achieving that with intelligent hedging through electricity contracts with retail end customers that is driving demand well beyond supply, and so it is greening its city at a rate that no other city in the nation has faced. Now, do they need to say we're Kyoto compliant to do that? No, the city of Austin hasn't taken that route. California is going to take that route, and we'll just have to see where it goes, where the rubber meets the road as an actual implementation. So like Kyoto, I think, 2012, everybody, and I hope this campus and campuses around the world will take a step back from the rhetorical and the bumper sticker mentality of it and actually begin to measure empirically what these policies do, because the substance is far more important than the rhetoric. And we have Kyoto signatories coming into our office all the time. We work with the British. I'm meeting with the King of Sweden tomorrow and the various Nordic companies. I lead the EU-US dialogue on biofuels. Kyoto does not cover transportation as a sector, something that concerns us greatly because it's fundamentally ignored. If it's not Kyoto, don't address it. So we think it's going to be important for the world to step back in these years and begin a responsible dialogue on substantive policies that accelerate market deployment of clean energy technologies. I'm not sure if the California initiative is that or not.
Thanks.
Very good. Okay, well, I'm going to, thank you very much, Andrew. I'm going to make a slight change in our agenda from the printed page. We are now going to do our outlining the possibilities of commercial perspective, because we have some people who need to catch a flight later in the afternoon. And then we'll come back for our overview from Kyriakos Zygarakis. So I'd like to invite Sue Siski, who is the Vice President for Environmental Safety and Engineering of Ford Motor Company, to come to the podium and talk to us right now. Thank you very much.
Well, I don't know about you, but I could have listened to Andy go on and on. He's been very charged up. I didn't realize he was a graduate from Rice, and so I can see why he'd be very proud of him and what he's been able to accomplish. Andy and I have had a pleasure of testifying before Congress on a number of these topics, and it is one that we've got a lot of work to do, and I think as you'll see in the presentation I have here, that it really is an integrated solution. There's a lot of people that have a stake in this, and we all have to work together to make it all happen. What I'd like to talk to you a little bit about this morning is where we're headed give you a little bit of an overview of what I want to talk about. One is, the fact is, what is our vision for sustainable mobility, something that we feel is very important for our industry. Talk a little bit about the auto industry in general, the progress we've made in improving our product efficiency, and then a little bit about the key challenges moving forward, some of the pathways for the future in terms of our advanced technology vehicles, and then what we think is a short-term and a real near-term benefit is the flexible fuel vehicles that use E85, and then finally the role of the stakeholders in this integrated approach. I think many of you recognize our chairman, and Bill Ford. He has said that improved sustainable performance is not just a requirement, but a tremendous business opportunity. And we do think that this is something that if we don't look at today, we won't be able to be around for in the future. And so what we need to find is a sustainable transportation model that it's affordable in every sense. We're looking for both a social, environmental, and economic model. And if you've read in the papers lately, the economic model is really challenging our company and all the auto companies. And we're a company that's been around for 100 years and would like to be around for the next 100. And so we have to keep our eye on this ball. And it's something that we have looked at very seriously, and it's one of the top goals of what we're trying to do. But as a result of that, we also have to maintain a critical balance, and that's between the desires of our consumers, the products they purchase, and our environmental practices and cost structure, which is essential to any business, whether it's automotive or any other industry. So we're always looking at how those work together. In the past, you've heard that the auto industry hasn't really made much progress, and I want to kind of correct that because it's contrary to what you've probably seen. The fuel economy has significantly increased. In fact, fuel economy rates in cars has increased more than 100% since 1974. And if you look at trucks, which are minivans, SUVs, and pickups, it's increased 53% since 1975. Today's average light truck gets better mileage than the average 1970 compact car. So you can think about, the progress we've made there. And the average 2004 SUV gets 33% better mileage than the average car in 1975. So we have made progress. It's not enough, and we all agree on that. But one of the things we've been trying to do is balance where we need fuel economy and not sacrifice performance. And I'd like to show you a comparison between two very similar vehicles, but very different in terms of what they're able to contribute. In terms of the 1985 Ford Crown Victoria, this was our fleet of the, it's still around, by the way, and it's pretty, it's been modernized, of course, but it's still a pretty traditional looking vehicle. You'll see it a lot in the police cars around town and some of the taxis. But it got 16 miles per gallon in the city and 23 in the highway. And if you contrast that to our new 2006 Ford 500, which is a front-wheel drive vehicle, it's getting 21 mile per gallon in the city and 29 in the highway. Engines are quite a bit smaller, but the horsepower is significantly more. The length, overall length, the size of the vehicle is about the same, but equivalent in terms of luggage, packaging, and passenger volume. But it's about 100 pounds lighter, and yet has a lot more safety features, a lot of things that we've increased in terms of feature availability for the customer. So we're trying to improve fuel economy, increase performance, and then provide all the needs that people want. And a lot of people say, well, that's fine, but in general, how do you fare? Why don't you make more fuel-efficient vehicles? Why don't you give us more vehicles that get 30 mile per gallon or better? And in fact, just to give you a reference point, Ford has 12 of the models that get 30 miles per gallon or better. These are some of our other brands, including our Mazda, our Volvo, and you can see here the Ford Escape Hybrid is included, the Ford Focus, a number of these vehicles. But these vehicles are projected to represent only 15% of our total light-duty volume. So you can see while the vehicles are out there, we still need to have people choose the vehicles, and what people are choosing are some of these, obviously, but also in other vehicles that meet their needs, whether they be large trucks or SUVs to carry passengers around. And people have also said, well, how come you don't look at more industry-leading segments in terms of fuel economy in general? And Ford is one of the top producers, and we lead in a number of the EPA vehicle segments, including the Ford Focus station wagon, which is the highest midsize station wagon, the Ford Ranger and Mazda pickup trucks, our Ford Escape Hybrid, which is the highest-rated sport utility vehicle, and the first American hybrid SUV. In fact, we recently gave a Mercury Mariner hybrid vehicle to Bill Clinton, and he's going to be doing some work along that line in terms of talking about the benefits of this as he drives around the country, as he's getting ready to, I think, work on a upcoming campaign. So, and then the Ford 500, as I mentioned, is the highest rated all-wheel drive large car. So we have a number of industry-leading segments. The ones I mentioned before, you say, well, are those just small parts of the market? But these are very large parts of the market. So what really is the problem? And I think one of the ways to look at this is our overall fleet fuel consumption. If you look at what's happened in terms of vehicle population and mix, it has a significant effect on how much gasoline we're using. If you look in the 1960s, there were about 68 million vehicles on the road, and today there's 226 million. So it's almost quadrupled the number of vehicles on the road. And then when you look at the fact that the mix of these vehicles have changed, it used to be about 16% truck, and now we're up to about 42% truck. So that's a very significant difference. So what has that resulted in is overall fleet fuel consumption. It's really influenced by the vehicle miles traveled. So we used to travel around 719 billion miles, and now it's up to 2.9 trillion. So you can see that not only are the number of vehicles on the road, but the number of miles they drive has increased. That means that we used to consume 61 billion gallons of oil, and now it's up to 137 billion. So even though the vehicles have increased by a factor of 4 and miles about almost a factor of 3, we've only doubled the amount of fuel, but that's a pretty significant amount of fuel. And the worst part is that 63% of that is now from imported oil, and that's a huge burden. So if you look at what we need in the U.S. as well as what is happening in the rest of the world, we have a real big problem to face. This shows some of the world market energy consumptions and the forecast up through 2030. And you can see that it's projected to increase by 71% from 2003 to 2030. And the most rapid growths are in countries including China and India. So we know that, as the world requires more and more fuel, and as the U.S. continues to have a healthy appetite for that, we have to do more in order to solve that problem. And one of the things that we've talked about is climate change, but also energy security. And as more than 60% of the U.S. oil is imported from foreign sources, and the volatility of gas prices, this is really putting a crunch on our country. So what are we doing in the auto industry? We're not sitting by watching this on the outside. We're obviously looking at ways that we can improve the vehicle technology as well. And here are some of the pathways to the future for advanced technology vehicles. Ultimately, we think that fuel cells are going to be an answer. The horizon is about 20 or 30 years from now. Some companies are, including Ford, are out on the road today with limited volumes of these test cars, fleet cars, but in terms of, and I'll talk a little bit more about what specifically we're doing, but this is really the end game, and we got to figure out how to get there. In the meantime, we have to figure out where do we get the hydrogen from to power these vehicles, and we think another bridge is a hydrogen-powered internal combustion engine. So we can use hydrogen in today's internal combustion engine. It will allow us to develop the infrastructure for hydrogen as we work on getting the cost down for fuel cells. We also think hybrid powertrains and modern clean diesels have a role in the way we're approaching this, and we think that's about 10 to 15% of the market for hybrids, and with diesels, as we see in Europe, it could be up to 50% of the market, and we think there's a lot of work to be done there. And we continue to do work in advanced gasoline internal combustion engines because we believe that they're going to be around for a very long time, and there's a lot that we can do to continue to work on those powertrains. Just to give you a little bit more on each of these, and this is our fuel cell powertrain. They are the highest efficiency technology. Currently, we've got about 25 Focus fuel cell vehicles on the road today to prove out this technology. But in order for us to be competitive, we have to really reduce the cost of this by 1 to 2 orders of magnitude. These are extremely expensive vehicles. The test cars we have out there are probably approaching, almost $1 million each in terms of the work that's being done. So to have test fleets in a significant volume is a very costly alternative. One of the ways that we can get around that is to look at where we can use hydrogen in internal combustion engines, and we have a test fleet of these as well. They're buses that we're using to transport people at the airports. In fact, we have a couple at the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. Maybe you've seen those. We just launched those recently, as well as the state of Florida and in Canada. We can hold 12 passengers, and it's a V10 engine that is supercharged, and it's run off of hydrogen. It takes a lot of fuel storage. That's why it makes sense in these big buses, because you can have the tanks that accommodate that. But it's a very clean source of energy, and it's something that we can work on to really understand what does it take to build a hydrogen infrastructure. I mentioned a little bit about our hybrid vehicles as well. We believe that hybrids do play an important role on it. It's probably going to always be a smaller set, though, of the vehicles out there. We've delivered in the Escape Hybrid a really no-compromise vehicle in terms of balancing the fuel economy and the functionality of the vehicle. We get over a 75% fuel economy improvement in the city, which is about a 400-mile range. We get up about 38 miles per gallon in the city, and we've been able to get all the benefits we have by downsizing the engine, using regenerative braking, and we believe that acceleration performance is similar to a V6, even though it has an inline-4. We meet all the SULAV, the super ultra low emissions vehicle requirements, and it's also an advanced technology, or PZEV, the partial zero emissions vehicle standard. So it's a very high standard, and we're the only hybrid right now that is certified as an AT PZEV in California. We're going to be producing, of course, not only the Ford Escape Hybrid, but we also have the Mercury Mariner and the Mazda Tribute, and we have a few others that are coming along the line. When it comes to diesel also, I think there's an opportunity there. We believe that diesel offers a 20 to 30% fuel economy increase, a good thing on the CO2 side. Higher performance, less noise, and less odor than the diesels in the past that you remember, and a lot more improvements in emissions performance. And a lot of people have badmouthed diesels in the past. We're really trying to build up the reputation of diesels. There's a lot that can be done, and you can see that Europe is right now almost 50% diesel, and there's a lot of benefits we're learning from the vehicles that we produce over there, and an opportunity for more biofuel for diesel as well. And then finally, as far as the gasoline engines, there's a lot being done. We've really have a family of engines around our I-4 engine structure, basically from 1.8 to 2.3 liters. It's all aluminum. There's dual overhead cam design, a lot of efficiencies that we've been able to provide that have offered us to introduce a PZEV status for Ford Focus, Escape Hybrid, and others. And it's about 1.5 million engines per year, so it's about 20% of our fleet. So if you look at the old muscle cars of the 60s and 70s, you know, this is really now the replacement for that, and still getting good performance and meeting the needs of our customer. So that's a little glimpse of how we're moving the technology forward. I'd like to talk a little bit about our pathway for today, and that's ethanol, or E85. It has been a transportation alternative fuel choice for more than 10 years. We have about 3.5 billion gallons of ethanol were sold in 2005 just for transportation purposes, and most of the U.S. ethanol is derived from corn. We believe that there's a way to move the future, and that's the cellulosic ethanol that we've talked about. Again, homegrown solution to reducing our dependency on foreign oil. And we've been kind of caught in this classic chicken and egg debate that Andy talked about. You know, that if we have the fuel, do we have the vehicles? Do we have the vehicles before the fuel? And we've been out there now for about 10 years with the vehicles, and the fuel hasn't been coming. And we've got to do more to spark that. So you're going to see in the next couple slides how we have grown significantly the number of vehicles on the road, and we need more work done to increase the ethanol production and get the cellulosic work going, whether it's be from rice straw or corn stover or switchgrass, wood chips, whatever we need to get there. One of the reasons people say, well, why ethanol now? And if we look at this as kind of a risk chart with its lower risk and more of a near-term proposition, as I mentioned, we believe that hydrogen is one of the energy sources for the future, and from an energy security standpoint, that would be great. But the infrastructure costs are very high right now. There's a lot of technology investment that needs to be done. As far as the political difficulty in developing this infrastructure, it's significant, and so we think it's further down the road from a time standpoint, where bioethanol it would benefit us from a security standpoint. The infrastructure cost is relatively low. There's a lot of investment to be made in the cellulosic version, but there's a lot of work being made right now in terms of producing from the sources that we have, and we can get there fairly quickly. What are we doing to promote E85. And by the end of this year, Ford will have placed a total of nearly 2 million vehicles on the road today that are flexible fuel vehicles that can use E85. And if you look at all the automakers combined, there's about 6 million vehicles on the road today. And if all of these were operated on E85, we would displace 3.6 billion gallons of gasoline a year. And that's like saving a full year of consumption in a state like Missouri or Tennessee. So it's significant. It's just that these people don't have access right now to the fuel. And last month, Ford, General Motors, and Daimler Chrysler voluntarily committed to doubling our production of flexible fuel vehicles by 2010. So we're going to have a lot of vehicles out there, but the problem is there's not enough fuel. If you look at what we have on the road today from a Ford standpoint, you recognize some of the vehicles, but we have both cars and trucks, the Ford Crown Victoria, the Mercury Grand Marquis, the Lincoln Town Car, and this year we expanded our lineup to include our best-selling vehicle, the Ford F-150, really an important vehicle for the farmers, and since a lot of the corn ethanol is providing right now, or corn that is supplying the ethanol, is in the Midwest, it made it a very good match. But a lot of people say, well, what does it take to make a flexible fuel vehicle? And that was one of the questions that we had. This is in terms of E85, but right now, because ethanol is a unique fuel with unique properties, the fuel tanks have to be changed. There's a lot of fuel pump changes, fuel line changes, injectors changed, calibrations change. The parts are not that great in terms of the number of parts and as far as the overall hardware. The biggest challenge for us right now is the development work to adjust the calibration so the vehicle can be driven on any mixture of between gas and ethanol, or E85, the whole range in between 0% to 85%. And what we have to do is obtain certification, both for the gasoline version and the E85 version. So it really is double the workload for us from a R&D standpoint in terms of getting the vehicles tested, getting the certificates from the government. So there's a lot of, we have a timeline in terms of how fast we could make every vehicle a flexible fuel vehicle, and a lot has to do with just prioritization on the R&D side of it. That's not trivial in terms of the vehicles being able to run in not only different climates with the temperatures, but also the altitudes and the adjustments that we have to make. Ethanol is, especially it blends from E10 to E20, has very high evaporative properties, and so meeting some of the emission standards is very much a challenge, and so we can't dismiss that aspect. The other big part of this is consumer awareness, and we've been doing a lot about in advertising. Hopefully you've seen some of these commercials that have to get people aware. Many people have flexible fuel vehicles out there and don't even know about it. And you might ask, well, why wouldn't they know about it? We produced a lot of Tauruses that were capable of being run on E85, and we used to have a little badge on them that said flexible fuel vehicles. And in the balance of trying to communicate this to the customers, many people thought that was a negative to be able to have this capability, and in fact it hurt their residual value when they sold the vehicle because they figured there was some complicated technology on this that would reduce the value of their vehicle. So we took some of the badging off just because we were concerned that it hurt them from a resale value. Now we're going back out and saying, hey, you've got a good thing here that you're able to run on E85, and there still is some confusion. Do I need to empty the tank and switch over or not? And just the idea that this is all transparent to the customer, they can fuel on E85, and if they've got gas in the tank, the sensors are able to calculate that. But it is an education process that we have to do for the consumer as well as for members of Congress, and we've got this fancy F-150 up on Capitol Hill to be able to show people that this is powered by ethanol and to get that message out that we need to do more along that way. We tell people, though, when you buy a F-150, you don't get the fancy labeling unless you do that yourself. But it is a real powerful message. If you look at the stations, and I know this was discussed a little earlier in terms of where are the E85 stations, and they are primarily concentrated in the Midwest. And right now, we're saying there's 940. I know the number has gone up this morning from 560 to 700 to 800. I think there's around 940, but that's out of 170,000 fueling stations throughout the U.S. So that's still a very, very small number. Now, some of the work that we've looked at, and we've been trying to develop a corridor of E85 stations. We've connected Chicago to Kansas City and with a number of E85 stations so people could drive through that corridor and be able to fuel entirely on E85. And we worked with our partner Verisun to be able to do that. We're encouraging other companies to join in. We have a partnership with BP, and they're going to be adding to the ethanol corridor as well. And we know that there's bills in Congress to encourage people to take one of those pumps that was mentioned, a mid-grade pump, convert it over. And we think the cost to convert a pump in each station is probably, less than $20,000 or so. We've heard all different numbers on that, but it's not a huge investment if you're using the tanks and things that are already there to make that conversion over. But it would be possible, and that's our goal, is to be able to drive from New York to California and be able to fill up on E85. Just a quick, talk a little bit about why biofuels further enhance our energy security. We think that there are 1.3 billion tons of biomass available every year, and that's enough to displace 30% of the petroleum consumption for transportation. So we think that that's really important on there. This chart is really two charts. It's the sum of the two charts add up to the 1.3 billion. The scales are different, but we're trying to show where this source would be. And then there's a lot of talk about, well, is ethanol that efficient from an overall energy standpoint? And if you look at the fossil energy ratio, and is the energy in the fuel versus the fossil energy input, it is very efficient, especially the cellulosic version. And so the energy benefit of any fuel should look beyond simply the energy density of the end product. You have to look at the full energy cycle. And so we think the overall life cycle or the energy efficiency of cellulosic ethanol is greater than the other fuels because of the low fossil-based energy that's required to produce that. So, what's it going to do to greenhouse gases? And there's a lot of debate and controversy on this, but this graph is trying to show on a grams per mile basis the well-to-pump CO2 equivalent emissions for cellulosic ethanol is actually negative. And so when you combine the CO2 generated from the pump to the wheels, and the net result is quite low compared to the other fuels. And you can see on the others they're additive, and the blue is the well to pump, and the pink or purple is the pump to well. But because for cellulosic it's already in the equation, it's actually a negative. The net result becomes very efficient. So when I mentioned before the role of the stakeholders and integrated approach, we think that there's just more than one solution here, and that not only the auto industry, the fuel industry, the government, and the consumers all need to be a part of it. From the auto industry standpoint, we need to continue to accelerate the advanced technology vehicles, and we are doing that. Problem is that there are a lot of solutions. There's no one single solution, and it takes a lot of investment. We have to continue to improve the efficiency of our products and to educate the consumers. So there's a lot that they can do even with eco-driving and how they drive the vehicles. The fuel industry, we're asking them to invest in developing and marketing E85. We know without their support that the small companies are not going to be able to overcome this. Verisun and others and the new investing companies are just not big enough to be able to make a significant dent, and we need to see the oil industry partner in this. And of course, they're looking at R&D for advanced biofuels, maybe things beyond ethanol. I know BP made the announcement about biobutanol, and there's promise about these, and these are great because they could be backwards compatible with the vehicles out there today, and there's a lot of things that need to be happening. Ethanol is not the only solution, but we're supporting biofuels in general. The government can continue to incentivize advanced technology vehicles and E85 fueling infrastructure. There's more that we can do with traffic management so we don't waste fuel. There's more we can do on public awareness and education. And then the consumers in terms of how they're driving and the vehicle choice they make. As I mentioned before, we have a limit really in what we can do in terms of controlling how many miles people drive, but that certainly we want them to have the choice of vehicle that they would like to satisfy their requirements. So kind of a final thought here is that Ford does view sustainable performance as a tremendous business opportunity. We don't see this as a negative. We see this as an opportunity for us to create the future. But our collective success depends upon overcoming a lot of the energy security challenges as well. And we think the advanced technology vehicles will build upon the progress that we've made, that E85 is a pathway for today with the ability to make an impact now. And there's a lot we can do if we really work together to make this happen. That while the problem is great, it's not insurmountable if we do put our resources together and work together. Thank you.
Okay, Sue needs to catch a plane, but we can take a few questions.
Okay.
Gal?
Just clarifications. Number one, I didn't hear you talking at all about plug-in hybrid cars. Is that not part of the Ford portfolio of solutions? You seem to be very confident that hydrogen will carry the day. Well, that's one of the reasons I sold my Ford stock is because I disagree with that. Number two, your late colleague Roberta Nichols had a very interesting report about Ford's experience with methanol, which is just like ethanol is an alcohol. Ford had nothing but good things to say about this experience, and it's not part of the. In fact, the flex fuel cars that you're making today are not equipped to run, not licensed to run on, warranted to run on methanol. Third thing is, why is it that you are producing the Crown Victoria as a flex fuel car, and yet the taxi version of the Crown Victoria, the one that, and we have about 13,000 yellow taxis running in New York City alone, are not in the flex fuel version. I mean, I would think that that's the best way to encourage big fleets to move to ethanol is through the taxi, the cab fleet. And yet Ford decided, for whatever reason, I don't know, not to apply this technology into those big fleets, and I wonder why.
Okay, you've asked a lot of questions here. I'll see if I can address each of them. In terms of plug-in hybrids, yes, we are working on plug-in hybrids. The difficulty, people think that plug-ins are a panacea, that this is going to be the answer to the future. There's a couple issues with plug-ins that you need to be aware of. Right now, we regenerate the electricity from regenerative braking is charging the battery, so it's virtually, free. When you talk about plug-in hybrids into the grid that we have today, a lot of that electricity is coming from coal and other things. So from an energy standpoint and from a CO2 standpoint, you've got to make sure that you're comparing, if we're really going to get the true benefit. When you look at Japan and other countries where they're running their electric power plants on nuclear fuel, it's a lot cleaner to be able to make that comparison. But to have a plug-in hybrid, the grid's got to be ready for it. It adds more weight to the vehicle because the batteries have to be larger in order to be able to drive further on the battery. And then there's an issue with deep cycling the battery, how long can you charge and recharge and how you do this. So there's work to be done. We are working on that. We don't know if that's the only answer, but we certainly are working at that. When you had said that we think hydrogen is the answer, I totally disagree with you. We are the only auto company that's playing in all different arenas with not only diesels, but with hybrids, with fuel cells, and with hydrogen ICEs. So we are looking at any possible avenue for this, and we think all of them will play a role. There's not one single answer, and that's why we are going to continue to do research. We're the only company that also has introduced a research project on E85 hybrids. So we're looking at the hybrid vehicle we have today and say, can it run on E85? And there's particular challenges with that as well, in that when the engine is running on electric power, we have to worry about the evaporative qualities of the E85. So there's different emissions challenges, and there's problems with the ejectors and different things like that. So there's a lot of research going on. So I'm sorry that you sold your Ford stock, but I think we'll show you that there is a lot that we are doing. When it comes to methanol, the whole issue of whether methanol or ethanol should win out, and I frankly can't remember all the background on it, but I think the industry in general felt that ethanol was better than methanol for a lot of different reasons. And I'll get back to you on the specifics because it's been a while since I've looked at that. In fact, our colleagues over in China are asking us about methanol and what did we learn and how can we share some of those lessons. But we think that ethanol really is a better product for us in the U.S., and I'll have to get back with you on the specifics along that line. And in regards to the taxis, we recently made the decision to put flexible fuel capability on the Crown Vic, and the taxis that you see are prior generations, but the new taxis do have flexible fuel capability. And as the fleet turns around, they'll be able to have that. That's not, it was a conscious effort in terms of what we were certifying. We had certified the Taurus and Sable, which was a large production for us. And then as this push came to increase the number of ethanol vehicles on the road, we looked at what vehicles we had done in the past and how quickly we could get them recertified for today's emissions. And it was possible on the Crown Vic, the Marquis, and the Town Car. And then we went after a project on the F-150 because we felt that would make the most impact. We sell 900,000 F-150s a year, so we wanted to go after our largest volume. We have a plan right now, as I mentioned, to double the number of vehicles by the year 2010, and we have a plan for every vehicle we produce to get it to flexible fuel. We know a lot of people in Congress are pushing to get mandates in there. We believe we can do this without mandates, but we're working very hard to do this. Right now, I think the whole push on ethanol has been really a perfect storm of everything coming together from an energy security standpoint, to the hurricanes that we realized how dependent we were with central distribution of refineries, and then just the crisis in the Middle East that continues to be in our minds. So there's a lot of things that are driving it. And now we have the vehicles, we really want to push to get the infrastructure for the fuel.
A quick question. Since the flex fuel vehicle that Ford produces does not have a flexible compression ratio,
Right.
Could you tell us what is the optimal compression ratio that you use for this vehicle? In other words, you must optimize the E85 vehicle for a certain composition. So what is this composition?
Right. I can't give you that right now, but I can tell you that's one of the comments that people have made before. You know, there's less energy in ethanol, and therefore the fuel economy is going to go down. But there is more octane, and if we could make a dedicated flexible or dedicated E85 vehicle, we could boost the compression ratio. So there are people looking at ways that, you know, how do we optimize that? And as we get more and more capability of fuel, does it make any sense to have dedicated E85 vehicles? But if you leave me your name and contact, I'll get back with you. I don't have that off the top of my head in terms of how we've optimized that.
Okay, one more question?
Right. My question really is about consumer education that you talked about. I think it's remarkable that you mentioned that consumers obviously do not understand the value of vehicles that they purchase, and you
Right.
actually reacted to their complaints by filling off the ad that should actually symbolize the importance of the vehicle. And then you're going back to it now.
Mm-hmm.
You think that the way you're handling it now, the auto industry, the fuel industry, and then maybe the government individually, trying to educate the population is sufficient, or should there be some sort of a partnership, perhaps creating a kind of a forum that would comprise the three legs, if I may borrow from Assistant Secretary Krasner, to focus exclusively on educating the population so that your vehicles should not only aim at the fleet and then begin to penetrate into the general population so people really understand what they're buying and how important it is. Or do you have a goal also as to when you think people should begin to understand what they have and what's out there?
Well, we are trying to work together. In particular, the big three are trying to work together to get that message out. I think you've probably seen a lot of the ads from General Motors in terms of go buy green, go yellow, or I'm not sure exactly the phrase, but they're talking a lot about the yellow. We're all commonizing with the yellow gas cap to signify that you can put E85 in. Our biggest concern is that, and I've heard this from other customers, is all cars can take this, right? And people are going to put E85 in a vehicle that's not compatible, and then they're going to have some real issues. So we have to balance that out. All of our vehicles can take E10, but they cannot all take E85 without the changes in the fuel system. So we want to get the message out that you need to have the right vehicle. It's important to get these vehicles, and then it's important to be able to recognize what vehicles are capable or not. So we are trying to work together, but we can take all the help we can get from the government as well, because it's really difficult for us to get those messages. We have commercials, we have our dealers, we have a number of things, but to get the average consumer, and I'm surprised the number of questions I get from consumers because there really isn't a total understanding, but they're starting to at least understand that it's available, and then the next question is, can I use it, or how do I get one, and that type of thing. So as we get more and more vehicles out there, it's going to be extremely important to get that awareness up. I know the Governor Granholm in Michigan just announced that we're going to have 1,000, she has a goal to have 1,000 stations in the next couple of years. So right now, there's only so much we can do to say to people, you've got a flexible fuel vehicle. When they only have, 800 stations, they might not even have one, in a 100-mile radius of their house. So we've got to find that right balance in terms of how we get that out. But we're open to all sources of that. The reason we took the badging off was there were fleets of vehicles that we were selling, government fleets and things, and they just asked us to please remove that because they were getting hurt in the market, and we had to react to that. So it just goes to show now I think the timing is right and people are more open to what's available, and so the messages are starting to sink in, but it takes a long time to educate.
Okay, well, thank you very much,
Okay,
Sue.
thank you.
Well, it's very interesting to hear about all the technologies, and I hope by the end of the 2 days we can put out a white paper and help with this education process, because I know I've learned a lot in the last hour and a half, and expect to hear more and more. So our next speaker is Mr. Paul Addis. He is the Chief Executive Officer of Louis Dreyfus Energy, and I'm not going to go into everybody's bios. They are here in our brochures. Thanks very much.
Thank you. How do I move these forward?
Oh, here, let me show you. This is, so that takes you forward,
okay.
that takes you back.
Fine. Thank you for having me. Good morning. The Assistant Secretary made a comment about his meeting with Harrison Ford and celebrities, and so my neighbor here, where I was sitting with, indicated I needed to indicate who I knew. I scratched my brain. I will tell you that the Louis Dreyfus Corporation is a family-owned corporation, quite large, but that the daughter of the current CEO is Julia Louis-Dreyfus, the actress, and I've met her once in some 20 years. So with that, let me begin. I've entitled my speech, Opportunity, Risk, Volatility, and Public Policy, because I think this is a little more complicated from my vantage point as a businessman, because we are fusing together two very different industries, that being agriculture and energy. And let me comment that my bio, which talks about being in the energy business and only about being in the energy business, does not reference my early career. I spent in a 25-year business career, my first 13 years were as an agricultural merchant, an energy trader, and a manager of agricultural facilities. So to some extent, I have some background in both. But I am an energy person today. Let me begin by providing you some background about the Louis Dreyfus Group. Dreyfus is a 150-year-old private company whose principal business is the merchanting of agriculture and energy commodities. We physically transport, store, and value-add these commodities via capital-intensive processing. We're also a very large trader, which I'll get back to in a minute. We believe our competitive advantage is the result of our participation in both the physical as well as the financial markets. Our business is global because the energy and agricultural markets are global and interconnected in a myriad of ways. I might add that these markets are constantly evolving, and what's happening relative to ethanol and corn and sugar is front and center of our business today as a merchant. We own or have in the recent past owned grain elevators, soybean crushing plants, orange juice manufacturing, ocean freight, meaning vessels to carry bulk cargoes and liquid goods, oil and natural gas reserves, petroleum, natural gas liquids, and natural gas storage and pipeline assets, and an oil refinery. Finally, we own sugar mills and ethanol production facilities in Brazil, where we are a major manufacturer. In South America, we own the largest soybean crushing plant in the world, and are in the process of building an ethanol plant in Nebraska and an integrated soybean crushing plant with biodiesel capacity in Indiana. In 2005, our agricultural revenues were in excess of $15 billion, while our energy revenues were approximately $13.5 billion. Those numbers are misleading. Those are revenues, and when one is both a manufacturer and a trader, meaning we are transacting in a product over and over again. Those numbers are somewhat meaningless. But we're a pretty big company. We are a small version of Cargill, which many of you may have heard of. As we all know, global energy demand has grown significantly over the past few years, while hydrocarbon supplies and refinery capacity have had a difficult time keeping pace. Explosive economic growth in China and India in 2003 forward, coupled with trend growth in the rest of the world, caught the energy markets by surprise. And what we have here is a chart that on a BTU basis, British thermal units, to link all those different energy sources together, just looks at the tremendous growth. I'll just point out by telling you that the other includes all the other categories of energy to include ethanol, but ethanol and other bioenergies. So that would be wind, solar, everything. This next chart shows you over time, the volatility of demand and how it's moved across time. So the energy business is very driven by world economic growth and world economic trends. The final chart is, to my way of thinking, the most interesting over the last few years. This shows us trend growth across blocks of time. And you can see how the industry and the marketplace in general were surprised by that tremendous growth from 2002 forward. If I'd used 2003 through 2005 as opposed to 2002, it would have approached 4%. It would be even greater. And that's the China-India phenomena that I mentioned earlier. So the market was caught by surprise. Thus, we had a demand shock. Meanwhile, increasing environmental awareness in the developed world has resulted in continuous, effective resistance to the opening of new geographies for hydrocarbon exploration and greenfield oil refining projects. Equally important, global BTUs are found in politically challenging places. Our vulnerability to a supply shock has embedded a risk premium in the price of oil and other energy products. Finally, the risk of groundwater contamination associated with blending MTBE into gasoline has essentially eliminated this source of gasoline BTUs, oxygenate, and octane from the gasoline pool. The result of these distinct but interconnected events is the perfect storm for the world agricultural industry. Ethanol produced from grains and sugar, biodiesel, and cellulosic ethanol all have become fashionable. Without question, energy prices have been signaling that new BTUs, new energy supplies, are required. We at Louis Dreyfus see biomass as an innovative, incremental BTU feedstock, and thus a piece of the answer to the expanding energy supply needs. We project that agricultural feedstock will achieve approximately a 5% share of U.S. gasoline consumption by 2012, assuming that current agricultural and energy prices and subsidy relationships remain similar to what they are today. And I'll come back to that point, that the price relationships remain similar. So what we have here is the piece of that gasoline pool, and you can see it expanding across time. While the growth of domestic ethanol and biodiesel supplies are a logical and useful contribution to resolving the current hydrocarbon shortage and enhancing our energy security, they are only a partial solution. And they raise a number of national security, foreign policy, domestic policy, and competitive market issues. I'm going to devote the rest of what I have to say about defining a few of those issues. All effective governments attempt to respond to national issues of importance. The critical question, though, is when governments act, is the response wise? Therefore, I question, is it wise public policy to subsidize proven technology? And I stress the word proven technology. Specifically, should ethanol production and biodiesel produced from grain be subsidized as well as buttressed by import duties on foreign-produced ethanol? Now, I might add that the energy industry has received its share of subsidies as well. So I'm not I don't have a bias that we should have energy subsidies and government initiatives to help as opposed to aids to the ag industry. I'm specifically talking about the proven technology. And let me talk about some of those implications. The distortion of free trade, which specifically retards the development of the highly efficient Brazil ethanol industry, and exacerbates the problem of high U.S. energy prices because of BTUs that might reach the U.S. that are hindered in doing so. We have a Brazilian industry that can grow sugarcane very economically and produce ethanol, and we've heard about it, with land mass that is available, and much more land mass is available to do that in Brazil, but we've got obviously an import duty on ethanol coming into the US. The retardant to the development of an industry, ethanol industry from sugarcane in the impoverished world is another issue. In a hostile and dangerous world, would it be wise energy policy and a wise foreign policy to incentivize the impoverished third world to develop an ethanol industry with targeted and short-term production subsidies? This might contribute to the development of a vibrant agricultural industry in these countries, which is critical to their economic development. If we incentivize the tropical world with subsidies for ethanol production, which aided the development of their agricultural industries, which are so impoverished and in so much trouble, would that be good foreign policy as well as good energy policy? Obviously, their friendship and allegiance to the U.S. would be fostered by such an approach, all else being equal. Continuing with the implications of our domestic agriculture and energy policies, with three robust sources of demand for grains and oilseeds, specifically feed for our livestock, edible oils, and energy, what happens if we have a grain supply shock? What happens if something goes wrong with our grains? Specifically, a drought in the U.S. Such an event would have a far greater impact on our livestock industry and grocery store bills than on our energy industry and gasoline bills. Clearly, the piece of our energy puzzle that comes from corn-based ethanol and biodiesel is very small relative to the whole. Agricultural BTUs will not drive energy prices for the foreseeable future, but energy demand for ethanol could drive agricultural prices. Free markets, which are free of subsidies, might have the same problem. If in the free market, with proven technology, people build ethanol plants and we have a drought, well, we'll have a drought. But what happens when we have that drought and we are subsidizing, encouraging that momentum, which is to build ethanol plants and drive that industry? If a drought were to occur and food price inflation resulted, I predict there will be much second guessing about the wisdom of this specific government action. What we have here is a chart that shows us the gross demand for corn usage in the U.S. and the ethanol piece. And you can suddenly see we have this unprecedented growth in demand for corn as a feedstock for ethanol. More interesting is the second chart. It's complicated to read, but let me see if I can sort of explain that. The line, this line is the total demand, the same line we saw earlier. If we have the normal trend yield, so that we get normal yields across the agricultural belt, this will be roughly 1 billion bushels will have of surplus to include ethanol demand. So that for total demand for corn, if we get normal growth across the ag belt, which is very susceptible to weather, we'll have a carry-out to usage, an inventory, which is what all markets are balanced around, is how much surplus supply we have versus total demand, will be in reasonable shape. However, if we were to have a drought in the immediate future, we will have a deficit of approaching a billion bushels of corn. So you can see that I raise a question which is a rather interesting, important one. From a public policy standpoint, should we be encouraging an ethanol industry with subsidies? Should we have import duties on sugarcane-based ethanol? It seems to me these are important questions, and the risks that we run as a nation are not insignificant. As to the competitive agricultural and energy markets, I wonder how many ethanol investors and debt providers have carefully analyzed the key drivers of their investment. I spent 10 or 12 years in the ag business, and then I went to the energy business for 15, and during that period, I ran a large part of the biggest electric utility in the country, American Electric Power. And in the period from 1997 through 2002, the Enron period, we saw a dash to build electric generation across the U.S., and we saw a lot of defaults, bankruptcies of those who had built this vast number of plants without thinking through the risks associated with the perception of incremental need for supply. So I don't suggest the world will ever be exactly the same, but I would suggest one needs to be quite careful. So specifically, have these parties who are playing in this industry understood their return is premised on a combination of abundant supplies of grains and oilseeds? So they are banking on that we'll have significant surplus supply. I would tell you that if the market gets into a fight between the energy business and the grain business over feedstock, the energy business will win out. It's so much bigger, therefore driving food inflation. We're also, those investors are banking on a positive and robust spread, price spread, between the price of agricultural feedstock and gasoline, diesel, and on ethanol import duties and domestic ethanol subsidies. What if these price spreads narrow? Now, many of you may have read over the last week about the Amaranth story, the hedge fund that it's, sort of mind-boggling, could have lost, whether it's $3 billion, $4 billion, or $7 billion, it's a lot of money, within a 5 or 7 day period of time. And so we hear about that, and we hear about their bet on natural gas. Well, what most of us don't know, which is that they also had a bet on the ags. They also had a portfolio of agricultural trades in their book, in their portfolio, which has impacted the price of the ags relative to the size of their ag portfolio. Sugar was one of the things they were betting on. Their idea was the energy connection. Every bet in their book was essentially bullish energy. Energy prices are going up, therefore they'll drag up ag prices. What I'm trying to point out is these are very complicated markets and very volatile markets, and therefore investors and participants, government policymakers need to think through all this range of interconnected issues. Droughts, abundant energy supplies, the overbuilding of ethanol plants, and the lowering of loss of import duties and domestic subsidies could produce very interesting consequences, to say the least. Additionally, how many capital investors have carefully analyzed the localized feedstock supply-demand picture? In commodity markets, we talk of the basis, or the localized price of a commodity versus the price at a myriad of other locations, the relationship of price at a specific location to other prices. Effectively siting an ethanol plant requires the optimal access to feedstock. This is especially critical relative to infrastructure. We're all aware of the difficulties of moving ethanol to where it will be blended or consumed. So this locational pricing is very, very important. Many fortunes have been made or lost via a lack of knowledge or knowledge around this interesting, important point, the basis or specific locational issues. Possibly the most interesting technological challenge for the agricultural energy industry is finding a way to make cellulosic material economically viable, which other speakers this morning have said it is not today. Here, my bias is that federal research dollars and subsidies may be of critical importance, and it would be wise public policy. I might add, when I gave you this chart earlier, that when we talk, this is trend yield. So I'm stepping back for a second. If we find Monsanto or others can find a way to tremendously increase the yield on corn, and I will never say never, that would change that basic price relationship. I think that massive yield increases at this point in time are questionable relative to what we've seen across time relative to yields, but nevertheless, that may be possible. Let me close by making several comments that confirm I've crossed over. I was an ag guy, I'm no longer an ag guy, which is where I began my career, but I'm an energy guy, I'm just teasing. The energy industry has been a critical contributor to our economic prosperity for over the last 100 years. Supply and demand imbalances are a norm in economic affairs. I don't believe the hydrocarbon industry is on its last legs. Witness the announced oil find by Chevron, Devon, and Statoil in the deep waters of the U.S. Gulf. Of equal interest to me, while we now have only the world's 11th largest proven oil reserves, about 2.5% of the world total proven oil reserves reside in the U.S. We do have the world's largest coal reserves, and by far, we have approximately 30% of the world's recoverable coal reserves. The technology to convert coal to a myriad of energy products now exists. To me, this area deserves more attention than it is currently receiving. We clearly understand the environmental consequences of coal, all of us do, and that they don't need to be repeated. But with 30% of those BTUs sitting here, it seems to me we need a much greater national push in that area. Equally important, I believe we must aggressively become more efficient in our use of energy over the coming decades. And by this I mean conservation. One of the attendees at this conference I was sitting with and sort of over eavesdropping on this morning, and he commented in effect about conservation that we really don't have a national push for conservation. It's not something the vast majority of talk or think about. Industry will respond because it responds to price signals. High prices will drive efficiency. But changing consumer behavior, in my mind, is going to require a much greater push and the involvement of government. I think the Vice President Cheney, said 4 or 5 or 6 years ago that conservation is a virtue, but not an economic policy, or words to that effect. I don't agree. I mean, far be it from me to take issue with the Vice President of the United States, but it seems to me we ought to be incentivizing conservation as well. Let me close by suggesting that biomass is rapidly becoming an important component of the U.S. and global supply-demand dynamic, but we all should be mindful that large, complicated markets, like the energy market, are inherently volatile, and agricultural BTUs, energy that comes from agriculture, will affect and be affected by many economic and political drivers. I just had a couple more slides which further emphasize this complication. What this shows is the price of corn and soybeans, the soybeans going into the oil, which biodiesel, and corn going into ethanol. And on this chart, they look relatively benign other than that one price movement spike there. On this chart, we've looked at the price of sugar. And here we see there was a perceived shortage of sugar, which may have been partly driven by financial players moving into the market and a fear of drought, but sugar prices are volatile. Here is a much more complicated chart, and this converts oil, it converts gasoline and natural gas, the feedstock which flows in, a feedstock also along with corn to make ethanol, puts them on the same chart, and we see the volatility there. And what we see most immediately, in the immediate moment, is a pretty significant decline in price. And now I've separated those charts and just moved them back into how we typically think about them. And so this is the price of crude oil. And this chart was done on September 6th. We're flirting with $60 now on crude. So we're off again pretty significantly. And then here's the price of unleaded gasoline, and you can see that this is what most people look at when they think ethanol in the blend, or E85. You can see the price has come down precipitously. And what we have in the market is what traders call a contango. There is too much supply today, so the deferred price is more expensive than the nearby price because you're having to incentivize warehousemen, those with tanks, to store the stuff. Now, we are approaching levels, if this continues, and the corn price is trending up because of that tightness and perceived risk associated with corn. So we are approaching levels where it could fast become uneconomic to build an ethanol plant. So I would encourage all ethanol capital investors to think about that. And I would also comment, not because I'm opposed to ethanol, I just think we have not been as deliberative and thoughtful about the implications and the right way to do this on a global basis. Thank you very much.
I was so furiously taking notes, I couldn't get up here to see if we have questions. Sergio?
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. Every energy commodity is traded internationally. every energy commodity has a futures and options market. Ethanol is sort of an odd player because it's traded internationally, but not quite. And it's only 2 years ago got the New York Board of Trade to launch a futures and options market, which hasn't really taken off. Could you comment what is missing for ethanol to become a true, real energy commodity?
Well, it is a true, real energy commodity, but if you mean, why have we not created liquidity in this financial futures market that exists? I think the reason is there's not enough players yet in the market. If you look at the number of participants who need to think about managing risk across oil, across gasoline, across natural gas, there are thousands and thousands of participants in the marketplace. In the ethanol business, there are a relatively few number of participants, relatively few number of consumers, the blenders today in effect, relatively few, and a relatively few number of suppliers. So we don't yet have enough participants in the marketplace to create a liquid market and therefore a more robust exchange. And that will require just more and more participants. Yes, sir.
My first is a comment and then a question. In my mind, conservation without the price signal is a noun and not a verb. Until you have the price signal, you're not going to get conservation. And if you want people to use less gasoline, you have to raise the tax. My question relates to the tariff that we have on imported ethanol from Brazil, from sugar. It seems to me that the ethanol producers would be smarter if they wanted to get rid of that tariff so that more ethanol could come to the coastal areas to increase its use in those market areas, and then that would build the market. It seems from what I've been hearing, the problem is building the market, not in the production side. And so if they wanted to build the market, it would reduce the cost and increase the availability. And as I understand it, part of this very high gasoline cost we had this spring was because we couldn't get any ethanol into the coastal areas, particularly in Houston and the Gulf Coast.
You asking me to comment?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not sure that was the specific reason we had high prices in gasoline, because we are in a global marketplace. We did have a much tighter supply-demand in spring because we were moving into spring for summer. We're planning for the driving season. And so things were tight. We had refinery turnarounds. There's still a number of refineries that weren't back online from Katrina. As to the point you make, I think it's a very reasonable point, but if you look at the U.S. ag industry over the last 50 or 75 years, it has had a major role from the federal government in terms of subsidies. Remember, we have a floor price for base agricultural commodities today. Corn, the buyer of last resort, or wheat, or sorghum, which is another feedstock for ethanol, is the U.S. government. There's a floor price. So the industry is structured to think in terms of subsidies, in terms of protective measures. I think your point is well taken in terms of the long run. But if I'm a short run investor and I want to, I want competitive advantage and to move more quickly than the rest of the market, I look short term. You're really referring to national policy, not what any one producer wants or doesn't want. The corn guy is thinking about his next harvest and how can I make the most money the next 24 months, not what am I going to do and what's right for my industry the next 20 or 30 years. I agree with you in terms of long-term becoming a viable piece of the puzzle. Yes, sir.
Did you say, sorry, I'm Andrew Kelly from Oil Daily. Did you say you're an established ethanol producer in Brazil and that you're planning to start production in this country?
We have two plants that are physically under construction. We have an ethanol plant under construction in Nebraska, and we have a integrated soybean crushing plant with biodiesel in Indiana.
And you're an ethanol producer
And we are an ethanol producer from sugarcane in Brazil.
And you kind of rhetorical questions. Is this a good thing for public policy? With interests in Brazil and this country, what do you want to see the government do?
Well, we are a business that will, within the ethical standards and the law, we will, do what we think is economically viable. I raised a set of questions around not national and international policy, not the thoughts of what is narrowly right for my company today. in the long run, we would generally support free trade. We think free trade is in the best interests of the U.S. economy, our company, and the world.
Last question.
I'd like to bring up one more issue regarding the removal of tariffs for Brazilian ethanol. How can you comment on a way to do that that doesn't increase the greenhouse gas emissions from deforestation due to South American agriculture? It sounds to me like you're talking about incentivizing a huge release of greenhouse gases.
Well, if we're going, I mean, I'm not an environmentalist and I'm not a scientist, so I'm not the best one to comment on that. Clearly, there would be, if we produce, if we churn up more acreage to produce ethanol from sugar, we will have more greenhouse gases. It's all a matter of choices. I don't have a narrow answer to your question.
Can I add an information? Your plant in Brazil is 2,500 miles away from the rainforest. The growth of ethanol in Brazil takes place in the savanna, not in the rainforest. And greenhouse-wise, sugarcane is a very efficient mitigator of greenhouse
I
gas.
just learned something. Thank you. I appreciate your time.
But let's-